I joined with my close friend Nick Exaros, who was in my high school class. We were seniors at the time, and we went off to boot camp on June 19th, 2006.
And why? What was the motivation for joining the Corps?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I mean, since I was a kid, I was fascinated by the military. I mean, I remember watching Saving Private Ryan when I was probably 10 years old, and that just
Wow.
completely blew my mind and changed my life. And, I was that kid who played with army action figures, dressed up as, a soldier in the backyard and hunting through the woods and all that stuff. And that was my whole childhood. And when I was probably 16 in high school, it was getting to that time where back then, I don't even know if they still do, but recruiters would call your landline phones at your house and say, "Hey, is, Andrew Koval here or so and so?" And an Army recruiter called and he said, "Would you like to hear more about what the Army has to offer?" And I said, "Yeah, I would actually." And he came to my house and I was sitting in my living room with my mom talking about it. And I had pretty much made up my mind. I wanted to join the military. That was my path. I had no intentions of college. I was not a good student. Kind of, I wouldn't say a troubled kid in high school, but had no direction. And I made that decision. So I go down to the recruiter's office, which was a pretty small building with a shared hallway with all the branches. So you had the Army there, the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, all in this one hallway. And when I go there, I'm going in with the Army recruiter, and the Marine Corps recruiting office is full of kids my age that are in this delayed entry program already or preparing to join it. And the recruiter kind of basically said to me, "Hey, why don't you join the Marines instead?" And then all these kids laughed at me, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I will actually." And then I changed my mind completely and went that direction.
So, I mean, at this time, Iraq is in the news every day. Afghanistan's in the news, I think a little bit less, but we're hearing about it. So I'm going to say the country is very much at war. I know there's this idea, no, the country was at the mall, the military was at war, but there was the war news every day. So it sounds like in your case, it wasn't, I'm going to go in the military so I can get the GI Bill and get money for college. It's, I'm going to go in the military because I want to do military stuff, meaning, and specifically thinking infantry kind of stuff or combat stuff, Army, Marine Corps.
Yeah, 100%. You're correct on that. I wanted every part of being Marine Corps infantry. That was all I wanted to do, and I knew, and as did most kids my age, that there was the war in Iraq going on and Afghanistan. But like you said, that was much less covered in the media back then, for sure. But I really had no concept of how serious that situation was. I had a friend who was a year older than me who joined the Marine Corps. It might have been 2 years, and he had gone to Ramadi in 2006 while I was still in high school. And then I had another friend who joined the Marine Corps Reserves, who was a couple years older than me, and
Yeah.
he was in Fallujah in 2006, I believe.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
they had both been to real war, and I wanted to be like those guys. That was a big part of it. And I wanted all that. I thought it was, the romanticized idea of it, the glory of it. I really wanted to serve my country. That was something that really meant a lot to me, and that was a big driving factor.
So I think you may have just answered this question, but maybe spell it out a little bit more. I mean, what did these wars mean to you at the time? Let's just say, just to create a scenario, you're on the bus on the way to Marine boot camp, and the guy next to you just says, so what do you think? What do you think this stuff in Iraq and Afghanistan is all about? Why are we there? What's the point of it? What do you think you would have said at that time?
At that time, I would have said because of the September 11th attacks. That was still very fresh in everyone's mind, in my mind too. And that was a big part of why I joined was that. You know what I mean? It was I had a real sense of duty because of that, and I fully believed that if I was being told by the president at the time and the government that Iraq was responsible for that in some capacity, then I fully believed in it. And the same thing with Afghanistan. And I didn't understand the complexities of geopolitics and
Right.
wars and all these things and what goes into it. I just knew that somebody had to pay for that, and I was so young during like the first and second battle of Fallujah, which were very pivotal points, and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I was too young to really conceptualize what that stuff meant and what was going on, but I knew I wanted to be a part of it before it all ended. And really do my part to serve the country for those attacks that happen.
Yeah. So you go through boot camp and then you go to your training after boot camp. What do you train to do? What is your job going to be in the Corps?
Yeah, so I joined the Marine Corps as infantry, which is basically an open contract. You don't have a specific job at that time. You go to boot camp with everybody else. You graduate boot camp, and then everyone will go to what's called uh, basic infantry training. I guess I can't or Marine Corps combat training. I think MCT. It's at Camp Geiger. Anyone who's not infantry will go to that Marine Corps combat training. Anyone who is infantry will go to School of Infantry. They're on the same base at Camp Geiger. Once you're in School of Infantry, that's when you get designated specific MOS, which is military occupational specialty.
Right.
So within the infantry, you have mortarmen, which is an 0341, machine gunners, 0331, assaultmen, 0351, 0311 is a rifleman, and then you have 0352, which is anti armor and tanks, which is what I ended up being. And the reason I picked that specific MOS was because I was told by a friend who had gone through this before me that 0352 did the least amount of humping, which is hiking with a ton of stuff on your back because that MOS is primarily vehicle mounted. And the reason that was so important to me, it was because I had broken both my hips in boot camp.
Right.
So
Wow.
yeah, so I had stress fractures in my hips that I thought were just a pulled groin, ignored it, turned into a serious problem. I still graduated, but I had to get have surgery on and get steel pins put in the femoral necks of both my hips. And I went to a rehab platoon and all this stuff. It was a real pain. But I was fairly confident I was going to lose that infantry MOS because of that. So once I actually made it to SOI, I thought, okay, well, I always wanted to be an 0311, a rifleman, but I can't risk humping 30 kilometers and re-breaking my hips. So what is a path I can take within this that's going to, give me the best chance to make it through? And that's what I landed on.
And it sounds like, you go to Marine Corps boot camp. You can use the phrase gung ho, ready to go, ready to mix it up. And it sounds like by the time you got through boot camp, even though you had this problem with your hips and you have pretty long rehab, then you go to training. But it sounds like your head was still in the same place. I want to get into the fight.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was really worried I was going to lose that infantry MOS. So once I had broken my hips and had to go through that rehab, like I said, I was real worried about losing that job. And then once I was able to keep it, I was equally, if not more, motivated to prove I belong there after going through that.
You know what jumps into my head as I'm listening to you. How old are you this time? 18, 19?
I was 18.
18-year-old kid. Um, and you're handing that kid a lot of power, right? I mean, the weaponry, the machines that you can be in control of. It's got to be in a way, I mean, kind of intoxicating. Do you think that's right? I mean, for a kid who's in the headspace you're in, and then you're handing this kid, I mean, the pretty awesome dress uniform of a Marine, um, the status of Marine, and these incredibly powerful weapons. I mean, that's got to be something that hits home. I mean, for a kid who's coming at things from your point of view.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things about the Marine Corps that they do a really good job of is instilling in you that you're the best, that the Marines are, the top of the food chain and the whole culture of it. And that's what makes them so effective in combat too, is that they have that mentality. So when you become part of that, there is a sense of what you just said, where it's kind of like intoxicating, I guess, and the power, but you're also still a kid and you're around what you feel like are a lot of grown men. So you're kind of operating in a sense of fear all the time. I mean, I remember the whole time I was in the Marine Corps up until probably the last year. When I went to Afghanistan, I was finally established myself. You're just nervous all the time. You're getting yelled at for this or that. You're getting in trouble for things that aren't even your fault. I mean, you're just like it's a constant state of anxiety a lot of the time. I mean, there's great times too, but you're definitely operating under a microscope a lot. So you
Mm.
don't really get a chance to get that feeling of power because you're on the receiving end of so many things knocking you down all the time.
Mm. Is that why sometimes combat vets or vets who know that they're going into a combat situation, I think even you, I mean, I think you're referring to Afghanistan when you say there's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be. Is that because you know that kind of the stuff you're describing now, the kind of the harassment that maybe comes with being a junior enlisted Marine, that stuff's going to go by the wayside, and now we get to put our training to use and really just let it go.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's I mean there's in the Marine Corps and the Army and all branches, I'm sure there's those who have deployed and those who haven't. And then when you get even deeper than that, it's those who have seen combat and those who haven't. Because you have to remember that a lot of people deploy, but to get to the position where you're actually exchanging gunfire or mortar fire or whatever with an enemy who's trying to kill you, it's a much, much smaller percentage of the entire military that's actually on that receiving end of those scenarios. So with that comes a tremendous amount of pride in a sense of prestige too, where like I looked up to those guys who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, like they're on a level that I want to get to.
You don't write about it other than just mentioning it in passing, but you did deploy to Iraq. Um, but Iraq doesn't rise to the occasion in terms of what you're looking for. But I wonder if you could just just describe what you did in Iraq, what that tour in Iraq was like.
Yeah. Yeah. So Iraq for me, by the time I had deployed there, the country was in a very different phase of that war. It was 2008. I think I deployed from probably April to November, 7 month deployment. And we at by that time we're basically just operating as a security force that assisted in training the Iraqi police to stand on their own at some point. So when I went there, we were the closest city to us was a city called Rupa. Our job was to basically train these Iraqi police and set up different little police stations along the highway routes and all this stuff. And the scene had just become so secure at that point that there really was no insurgency in that part of Iraq where I was. That's not to say other parts weren't still extremely dangerous, but where I was in my experience, it was just training those guys and standing security posts and doing patrols that really led to nothing most of the time. I mean, I remember when we'd find an IED, I'd be amazed that there was actually people there that were still wanted to harm us because that's how infrequently we dealt with people that were giving us any kind of hostility.
Wow. So given what you've said, about where your head was going into the Corps, it sounds like it was a disappointing deployment.
Yeah. Oh, it definitely didn't give me and a lot of the other guys what they were looking for, especially with our battalion who had deployed to Iraq previously, and it had been an eventful deployment.
Wow.
It left a lot to be desired when you're a young guy who's trying to prove themselves.
Um, so you say when you were in Iraq, one of your main tasks or your main task was to train Iraqi police. After your deployment there, by the end of your deployment, what was your assessment of them? It sounds like there's not a lot of fighting going on in that area. What was your assessment of the Iraqi police? Did you leave Iraq after your deployment thinking confident that the Iraqis would be able to manage their own country and manage their own internal problems?
No, no, not at all. I didn't really have a great experience with them. I mean, they didn't outright do anything to upset us directly, but they did not seem like they were a competent police or military force, and it didn't seem like any of them had any desire to become one either. They were probably just getting paid well enough to be police officers at the time that that's what fit. But I'm sure they all knew that that whole situation was coming to an end at some point. They knew that the United States wasn't going to stay in Iraq forever, so they just picked the side that worked best for them at the time. And then I'm sure those guys had the thoughts that this is going to end at some point, and I'll figure something else out. But I don't think being an Iraqi police officer was a huge amount of pride to them, where they felt like they were doing something bigger than themselves and putting on a uniform that contributed to something. And I don't want to speak for all of them. There might have been lots of them that were very competent and very brave and very selfless, but the ones that I dealt with weren't particularly. No.
Did that impact your thinking about the war on terror and, what the U.S. was involved in?
I don't think so, only in the sense of I never really thought of Iraq as this mission that was anything more than kind of retaliation for the September 11th attacks. And if that's where they were going to send us as Marines, then that's where I was going to go. The bigger picture really never meant anything to me. The political side of it and all that stuff is just, if that's where Marines are deploying and that's where combat is, then that's where I want to go.
Sure.
And it really didn't think about it beyond that.
I
It
mean,
took me
you're,
many years to kind of analyze that stuff later.
yeah, I mean, you're what, by this time you're 19, something like that when you're at
Yeah, 19. I think I turned 20.
19 or 20.
Yeah.
Let me connect what you just said to the ANA, to the Afghanistan national, I think is it ANA, Afghanistan National Army, is that what that stands for?
Yep.
Uh, in Afghanistan, you did some, I think you did some work, at least among them, around them. So now we switch theaters. Now we're in Afghanistan. What was your perspective on them? How did you feel about them as allies?
A little bit of the same, but it was hard to say because in my experience with them, most of the fighting had been done by the time those guys came in and started living with us. So when I got to Afghanistan, we were part of a Marine Expeditionary Brigade that was put together by President Obama to do a massive troop surge into the Helmand province and kind of take back this area that the British had held for a long time, but they didn't have the manpower or the funding or whatever to really do it effectively.
Right.
And it had become a stronghold for the Taliban and their popium or opium trade and all that. So they made this plan to send about 11,000 Marines down there and take back cities all along the Helmand province, going towards the Pakistani border. And so that operation started. We left June 28th. The official Operation Kunjar started July 2nd. And the first 3 weeks of July, for me anyway, was when most of the fighting was. That was when the Taliban tried to make a stand. That was when they were directly attacking us with small arms, rockets, mortars, what most people would consider conventional combat, what they would think about in movies and stuff like that. So by the time the ANA and the Afghan police had come down and got established in these bases that we'd made, that had kind of come to an end and it had turned into the IED war, in the indirect fire war, where we never really saw the Taliban or directly engage with them anymore. So I never got a chance to really see what they would do in those situations. And that's not to say they wouldn't have performed bravely. I don't know, but they certainly didn't strike me as having the discipline that the Marine Corps has on any level. And they definitely didn't stick out to me as being anything that could be sustainable after we left.
So I want to ask you about these two phases of the conflict in Afghanistan as you experienced it. So phase one um, sounds like a lot of firefights. I'm guessing ambushes and so on. And then the second one, just IEDs, constantly dealing with IEDs. Um, how would you characterize that first phase? What was the fighting like, and what was your assessment of the Taliban as an adversary?
Yeah. So for me, when we left Camp Leatherneck, which was the main staging area for this entire Marine Expeditionary Brigade and all the units going down to their respective areas of operation, I really had very little idea of what we were getting into. I really didn't. I mean, I wanted to go and see combat just like everybody else did, and I wanted to be part of this big mission. But the reality of what that was, I really didn't know. And at that age, you're so young and excited, you don't really think to even be scared. It's kind of hard to explain, but it wasn't. I wasn't afraid going into it. I mean, I had anxieties and nerves, but I was more so excited to just be part of it. Like I felt lucky that I was actually part of this mission and getting to do what I had joined the military to do. And by the time we got down there and the fighting started and all that, it was intense. And I remember thinking specifically, these Taliban guys have a lot of courage to be going up against us and all the assets we have. Because we were in light armored vehicles, LAV 25s, which is like a tank with wheels, basically, with a 25 millimeter cannon on top that can do massive amounts of destruction. We have our own mortars, we have artillery on call. We have shows of force from F-18s flying overhead. I mean, we have the entire might of the American military behind us. So
Yeah.
the fact that these guys would even engage us at all in what would be considered a conventional firefight, I found it very astounding. I really did. And the fact that they kept it up for as long as they did too was pretty remarkable to me. I was surprised it didn't happen sooner, that they switched to those tactics of just kind of hit and run in IEDs.
So this phase that we're talking about now, I mean, was it primarily ambush followed by firefight? Was that the pattern that you saw?
It was, yes, there was ambushes, and there was one specifically I remember, which was a very big turning point in my life. It was on July 6th, and we got caught in an L-shaped ambush. That was a combined small arms machine gun fire and mortars, where they had basically bracketed this road that we came in on, and then when we went to go out, they had it laid direct fire with mortar rounds, and were exploding all around us as we were in vehicles, and then we had dismounted scouts as well.
Yeah.
But they would do a lot of hit and run tactics where they attack with small arms fire mortars and then just get out of there, and that was kind of their most effective way because they didn't have the assets we had.
Um, so I want to come back to where we are now, but before that, I want to ask you, a lot of times Afghanistan vets will say that when they were there, they saw things that reminded them that the Russians had been there 79 to 89, burned out tanks, burned out planes, just stuff, relics from when the Soviets were there. Did you see any of that stuff?
Yeah, we saw some outposts. They had smaller ones that they had built kind of in the same areas that we went to. I never saw any tanks or anything like that, but you could tell that they had been there. And the area specifically that we were in, it was a city called Khan Neshin, and it was right at the hook of the Helmand River. So it was the closest city to the Pakistani border. And no one had been there since the Russians. So the British hadn't been there. It was completely uncharted territory for the
Yeah.
United States.
Did that cause you, again, I know you're young, and so in the world of war, I don't think there's a whole lot of philosophizing going on. But did that cause you to pause a little bit when you saw these Soviet things and you think, wow, okay, a superpower was here, not too long ago, and they're not here anymore. Did that cause you to pause at all and wonder about what's going on in Afghanistan?
It did, but back then I didn't know as much about what the Soviets did there as I do now. So I didn't really have that contrast in my mind.
Yeah.
And you also you think, okay, well the Soviets, they were the bad guys, so they were there just raping and pillaging, and they were there to like destroy the Afghan people. We're here to help them. So it's like the mission we had didn't feel like it could be comparable to what they did. We were trying to build their country into something that was sustainable, not just conquer it.
Now, this is kind of a big picture question, but I'm interested in your response to it, just based on what you experienced. Because you described, Taliban tactics, ambush, firefight, hit and run, the kind of stuff we hear about from the Viet Cong in Vietnam, similar stuff. You mentioned the incredible, overwhelming firepower that NATO forces and the U.S. as the lead NATO force can bring to bear against the Taliban. You've got air support, you've got artillery support, the vehicles that you're in. Um, and yet the Taliban ended up back in control of Afghanistan. Just and I'm asking just for, your personal reflections. How does that make sense to you? I mean, we had this overwhelming power, and yet the Taliban ended up back in control of Afghanistan. Just given your experience, how do you make sense of that?
Well, there was never a point when I was in Afghanistan that I thought that it was a sustainable operation, that I thought the United States was going to turn this into a democratic country with elections and the people are going to love it and it's going to be this prospering nation. There was never a time I thought that because nothing about that country that I saw was conducive to that. And you can't force that, whole democracy in a box concept on people that don't even want it anyway. So it
Mm.
was very obvious to me that the Taliban would just wait it out until we left. And, you'd have to compartmentalize that into the sense of, all right, well, this is our mission, the scope of it, the next 7 months. So we're going to do the best job we can. What happens after that is in the politicians' hands because it's too much to think about at the time when you're there. And you don't want to diminish the importance of what you're doing either by thinking it's, a waste of time or it's, coming to an end or whatever. But as you look at it, the more distance grows from that experience, you still kind of have to think about it like that the mission we had is what mattered. We did what was asked of us, and we're proud of that. And wars ending in a messy, convoluted manner has been every single conflict we've been in since World War II. So it's like it doesn't, the bigger picture usually doesn't make sense. It usually doesn't end in a good way or in a clean way. So it's just there's nothing about that country that seemed like it wanted to be anything but what it has been. And I didn't go to the bigger parts like Kabul, Bagram, all these places where there probably was some democracy instilled and you had women going to school and actual voting happening. But the areas that I was in the Helmand province, it didn't seem like they'd ever have that or have it be sustainable at least. And I'm sure there's a lot of Afghans who wanted nothing more than that. But I think that the tribal culture and the history of the country in itself was just too strong to have that change course at any point.
So it sounds like you're getting at what I've heard so many times from war vets, um, that the war was not about, no, the war wasn't in your mind, the war is not about Afghanistan's future. The war is about me and the Marine next to me surviving and going home.
Yeah, to put it simply, I would say so. I mean, the mission was important, but the country of Afghanistan didn't mean a great deal to me. That's for sure. It 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 wasn't something that I mean, we wanted to make a difference when we were there, and it meant something then. But like I said before, I just knew it wasn't going to be sustainable in my heart. I knew that no matter what kind of election polls we set up and kind of schools we set up or whatever, they don't think in the same timelines we do. The country of Afghanistan doesn't think in 4 to 8 year election cycles where they're thinking very long term. They're thinking, okay, the Soviets were here from 1979 to 1987. This will pass too. We don't care if it's 20 years, 30 years, they'll leave at some point. And it was very obvious to me that that was the thought process to a lot of the people in the area we were in.
Yeah. Did you have interactions with, I'm going to say Afghan civilians, and I know that, I want to put that in quotes because I know that it's not always clear who's really a civilian and who's helping the Taliban. But did you have any kind of interaction with Afghan civilians at all when you were there?
I had lots of interactions, but they were very minimal in the sense of we'd be asking them something through an interpreter and they'd talk back to us, and it wasn't anything really meaningful or impactful that would allow me to learn the Afghan culture or anything like that. It was almost just in line with whatever mission we had going on.
So just what was your gut impression after having these interactions of these folks?
More often than not, that they were either Taliban or supported the Taliban or were in a position where they had no choice but to take the side of the Taliban, or they were just very simple poppy farmers who just wanted to be left alone and we were just the new thing passing through.
Wow. Um, let's focus on that first phase where the combat is, ambush, hit and run. I wonder if there's a particular moment or particular incident or event in that part of your deployment that really stands out in your mind. I'm sure you have a lot of memories, but I wonder if there's one in particular that really stands out. Like, here's something that happened that really symbolized this phase of my deployment in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I would say it was July 6th, that firefight we got in. That was, for me, it was the most significant point of that deployment because it was one of the only times where me and my crew in my vehicle were directly involved in that ambush. It wasn't something happening to the company or another platoon and we were kind of showing up to support them. We got caught right in the middle of a complex ambush and a mortar round exploded probably 15 to 20 feet right next to my vehicle. And then they opened up on us with machine gun fire that the rounds were pinging off my vehicle. And I was firing back with my M240 machine gun at them at this compound. And it went on for quite a while. And that was probably well, I would say the second closest time in that point where I thought there was a legitimate chance that I was going to die. And that really was the first taste of combat that I had was that. We went from a very uneventful, hot, boring day of just monitoring this compound in this area to saying, okay, we're going to pack it up. We're going to get out of here. And we go to leave. And then all of a sudden you got five, six mortars exploding
Wow.
within 50 meters of us, and then machine gun fire opening up. And, I had never been in anything like that. I'd never even been shot at before that.
So you say, this is one of those moments where you think you might die, but you're in the middle of a firefight, so I don't think you're you know, I don't think you're having deep thoughts and getting into philosophy or anything like that. Was that just kind of a matter of fact realization? Okay, I'm gonna get into this fight and I'm gonna keep doing my job, but this might be it, and that's how it is.
I remember distinctly the mortar round, one particular mortar round landed so close to my vehicle that it rocked the vehicle. And
Wow.
as soon as that went off, I heard the small arms fire open up, and I could hear them pinging off the side of the vehicle. So my natural reaction, I was the vehicle commander, so I'm sticking out above the top of it with a M240, which is a 30 caliber machine gun that you can swivel around. I immediately ducked down in the vehicle because I don't know how many more of these explosions were happening. I thought the next one was going to land right on top of us because they had bracketed us. And I remember being in that vehicle crouched down, and I just said to myself, stand back up and start shooting back at these guys. Like it was a very life-changing moment for me where I realized that I was nearly paralyzed with fear, but then I just decided to make the conscious decision to do it anyway.
What was it that provided the motivation to do that? Commitment to the other Marines, not wanting to look like you're falling down on the job? I mean, why not just hunker down with the excuse that, the mortars are coming down on us? Why get back up and get right back into the fight? What's driving that?
I think that same, um, esprit de corps they put you in as a Marine. Every Marine's biggest fear is that they're not going to perform in combat or they're going to let their friends down. I mean, that is the biggest fear, or to look like a coward. Nobody wants that. And you get in these moments where you're now being tested and you just have to make a choice. Am I rising to this occasion or am I going to fall to it? And as at the time I was 21 and I was a corporal, I was a vehicle commander. I had enough pride in myself and enough pride in the Marine Corps and all these things that it didn't even seem like a choice to me.
Yeah. Were you just firing at muzzle flashes, or did you ever actually see the enemy during this fight?
Firing and muzzle flashes, but we also saw them within the compound. And on my vehicle, we had what was called a Mark 12, which was it's a M16 with a suppressor on it and a 13 power Leopold scope. It's used as a designated marksman rifle in platoons and like a sniper rifle, I guess you could say. And we just happened to have that on my vehicle at the time. Coincidentally, every vehicle kind of took turns carrying it around. So after this firefight started, I was using that to spot targets. And when I was using that, I could actually see them in the compound and was shooting at them with that.
You've described, the difference between these two phases. So phase one, ambush, firefight, hit and run. Phase two, basically just waiting to hit the next ID or out, looking for IDs. What's the psychological difference between these two phases, if that makes sense? And I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I could explain really what I'm getting at, but does the question make sense? I mean, when you're out there and you're thinking, all right, we've got a good chance of getting ambushed, getting into a firefight, and then over time that changes to, okay, well, we're not seeing the ambushes and the firefights anymore. We're not seeing the hit and run anymore. Now we just know that, it seems like there are IDs out here constantly, and it's just a matter of finding them or when one of them goes off. Does it make any psychological difference at all when you head out of the wire and you're heading into these two different realities?
Absolutely. Yeah, huge. Because the biggest difference is when you're getting an ambush, you can shoot back at somebody, or at least feel like you're shooting back at somebody, even if it's just muzzle flashes. Or you can, call in artillery or use mortars. You feel like there's some retaliation or retribution or whatever. You're part of the fight. When an IED is going off and there's nobody to shoot back at, you just feel like a complete victim. And it's a terrible feeling. And it's terrible in the sense of it can happen on a completely mundane, hot, sweaty day where you're slipping into your most complacent state too, because you've been driving through the same area for weeks on end, and then all of a sudden this happens, and it there's nobody to retaliate against, and then you just You go back and then you go back inside the wire and then you go back out and you do it again, and it wears on you in that sense, and it just you don't feel like you're in a fight. You feel like you're just driving around waiting for something to happen, and when it does, you have no recourse.
Mm. And how long did this phase go on where this is really what you're dealing with, just IEDs, IEDs, IEDs?
The rest of the deployment from, I would say, the beginning of August on, so August until October into November, and then as the longer we were there, the more we had the engineers and EOD techs to clear routes, and we got more proficient at avoiding the areas. But they were still out there, and even when the IEDs became the main threat, they would shoot at us with mortars and rockets from a distance. A big tactic of theirs was to they'd come in with a two-man crew on like a moped or motorcycle, set up a mortar tube, drop a few mortars at our bases because they knew where we all were at that point. We've been staying in the same place for a while, and then they'd get out of there. So explosions would happen. We'd be on the receiving end of it. Most of them were inaccurate, but they'd come close enough to the bases to where it was alarming, and then they get out of there. So you never even see them. So you're either running over IEDs out in the desert or near the city, or you're getting shot at with mortars and rockets that you have no recourse against too. So they really became ghosts out there, where you didn't feel like you were in a fight anymore.
Yeah, so I mean, it must have felt like, these folks, they're just going to keep harassing us. They're just going to keep doing this. They're just going to keep wearing us down psychologically. I mean, it has to be exhausting psychologically dealing with this and not being able to fight back. You're just on the receiving end. We're just, the Taliban and all the folks who are helping them are thinking we're just going to keep doing this until these Americans leave, until we wear them out and they get out of here. Is that kind of what it looked like to you at this time?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what I'd be thinking if I was them.
So you write about a dream that you had, and the dream comes near the end of what you've written, and I want to ask you about the dream as a way of, getting into a topic which is really kind of at the center of your memoir. Um, what was that dream that you write about?
Yeah, so my friend Nick, the one I mentioned earlier, who I joined the Marine Corps with, he got killed during that deployment with 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. He was in a city called Garmsir, which was about 40 kilometers north of us. We were in the same area of operation, but just a different city. And on July 23rd, he was in a Humvee light armored vehicle, and ran over an IED and killed him, killed his driver Jeremy Lasher, severely wounded his turret gunner Dom Davila, and then injured his corpsman in the back seat Trevor Parr. And that was very devastating to me. That was my best friend I joined the Marine Corps with. We went to Afghanistan together. We'd seen each other in Leatherneck. Finding out about that was really a crushing thing to me, and it added on top of this whole IED threat that was out there too. Now it was somebody who I was friends with that extended beyond the Marine Corps had been killed by this. It's very hard to mentally think about that and deal with it, because that when you go home, he's not going to be there. Our families all know each other. The context in which we know each other wasn't just the Marine Corps, so it's very unique in that sense. And that crushed me in many ways, but it was a reoccurring thing to be just pondering. Why would I live and he would die? And you think about that with anybody who's getting killed over there in combat, is why them instead of me? But as the deployment went on and I thought about that more, and I started getting a little deeper and philosophical about it because of how much it impacted me. I had a dream, like you mentioned, where he kind of came to me and said, everything's going to be all right. That's the short version of it. And was that him actually coming to me? I don't know if I believe that or not, but I certainly believe that it was my subconscious reassuring me of what we were doing out there. And he was a constant thought in my mind the entire deployment, was that, and getting home and trying to deal with all that. And the idea of going home was scary too, because I knew he wasn't going to go home. I was going to come back without him. So it was weighing on me very heavily. The what I didn't know at the time, and I realized later in life, was that the survivor's guilt had already been firmly implanted in me, and it I didn't know how to deal with that at 21 years old.
And so he's killed and his body goes back to the States, but you also went back, right? Your commanding officer gave you the opportunity to go back to the States to be at the funeral and to speak at the funeral.
Yeah, which was a huge pivotal point in that deployment. So Nick gets killed, and at the time, a classmate of ours from high school was interning for Senator Jack Reed in Rhode Island. She tells the senator the story about how Nick Exaros was killed. His friend he went to boot camp with is still in Afghanistan, just in a different area. He's on his, his body's on his way home. All that. Senator Reed goes to Senator John Kerry. They get together and they say, okay, we're going to find out where this kid is and get him home. And that resulted in, coming from the chain of command all the way from the Secretary of Defense, who was Robert Gates at the time, down to Brigadier General Lawrence Nicholson, who was in command of the entire operation, the Marine Expeditionary Brigade, to my battalion commander, Tim Groton, calling me into his command post tent one night and saying, hey, I'm sorry about your friend. And if you want to go home to attend his funeral, you can, which was a crazy concept for me because I was in the middle of the, Afghanistan in a
Well,
combat outpost.
right.
And, I thought about it. It was probably one of the most difficult decisions I ever made in my life to leave my Marines to go home for that funeral. And he basically told me, listen, I understand you're conflicted about this, but we're going to go into a bit of an operational stand down just to kind of recoup and refit to go back out and start a another operation soon. So you go home, you're not going to be missing anything. So I make the decision to go home. A helicopter came the next morning, got me from our combat outpost, which started the journey of going from there to Bagram, from Bagram to Germany, from Germany to uh, Portland, New Hampshire, I think, is where I flew into. And then I made it home just in time for the wake, showed up in the same desert camis I was wearing in Afghanistan,
Wow.
and, saw everyone. It was very overwhelming to go from that setting to that within a 3 day period. And then for his funeral, I read a eulogy that I had written in Afghanistan that I was going to ask my mom to read on my behalf. And I read it in front of everybody in front of the church. And it was really a very difficult time in my life, but a very important one.
And one of the things that you write about is, in the aftermath, I mean, you write a lot about the meaning of Nick's loss to you and the impact that had on you. And then you also write about, feeling angry that folks were showing concern. And you indicate you understand why they're showing concern and interest, or, they're paying attention now. And you understand why they're paying attention, and in a way you appreciate it. But at the same time, if I'm, if I have this right, if my interpretation of is right, if my memory's right, but there was also a sense of, anger, like, why was it that it took this for you to pay attention to what's going on in Afghanistan, what we're doing? Is that right? Is my recounting of that right?
Yeah, it's right. Partially, that was definitely part of it. I kind of felt like nobody cared or even probably knew we were in Afghanistan until this happened. But I think a lot of that was, when you have something very traumatic and very impactful happen to you, you have a lot of anger, and you got to find places to direct that to. And a lot of times it's to people that don't deserve it. And maybe there were some people like that that didn't care or know, but that doesn't mean that their gratitude and um, affection towards it after wasn't just as sincere. But being a 21-year-old kid, you find outlets to direct this anger towards, and for me, it was a lot of the people that, it's like, okay, well, why you didn't care? We were out here before. Now all of a sudden it's a big thing, and me surviving and Nick dying made me feel like a lot of spotlight was on me in his absence, and that made me very uncomfortable, as though I was kind of like a walking reminder of Nick dying. And it just compiled on that survivor's guilt too. And when I went home, everybody was amazing. You know, the entire community and the outpouring was something I'll never forget. And I would say that everyone was sincere in what they expressed and what they did. It was more in the it was more in the sense that I just didn't know how to receive it. You know, I didn't know how to receive that gratitude, and a lot of it I had to in my mind turn it into something negative in certain aspects because I had so many negative thoughts anyway with the anger about Nick being killed and the survivor's guilt of me living. So a lot of it I would say was unjustified on my part to feel that way.
Mm.
And that took me time to process that too. And, you know, all those thoughts I just kept to myself. I never said that to anybody who's expressing their gratitude or went around being like, oh, you don't get it. You don't get it. That was all internal,
Right.
but it was unjustifiably so internal. It was just compiling on already, you know, anger and guilt that I had that didn't need to be there.
What was your reaction to August 2021 when U.S. pulled its last troops out of Kabul and the Taliban took over?
I wasn't, I mean, I was angry at the way it was done. I thought it was very irresponsible and reckless on behalf of the United States to do it in that fashion and to give a timeline and you know, set the stage for that to happen. But I was angry about the position that the Marines there were put in. I mean, you had a battalion of Marines plus, you know, support personnel and whoever else was there trying to facilitate this evacuation, and they were put in a completely no-win situation. And as soon as that was on the news, I remember thinking, "There's going to be some sort of suicide bomber or massive attack that's going to happen. There's no way. You're looking at scores of people trying to get out of the country. It just looked like an absolute disaster." And I'd be lying if I said I didn't have thoughts of, okay, well, what was it all for? But I kind of knew in my heart that it was going to end that way, one way or the other. It was just going to be a matter of, do we leave in a dignified manner, or are we leaving in some hurry that is really kind of embarrassing for us and leaving these Afghan people hanging out to dry, which is what we did. And it upset me. And to see Afghanistan in the news again after it not being in the news for so long was really something that caused me to reflect on my own experience and start kind of unpacking that too, because I felt like the death of you know, I would call it the death of Afghanistan for the America's involvement in it was kind of like the death of a part of me, you know, because a part of me was born in Afghanistan in those moments. Like there's everything before that and everything after. And so that chapter of my life, I felt like it didn't come to a close, but it was the catalyst to make me look at those events and really start unpacking it and figuring out what it means in the broader context of my life and how I'm going to move forward with it.
So that's an interesting phrase. A part of you was born in Afghanistan. What part of you was born there?
I would say the adult part of me. You know, everything before that, before going on that deployment, before seeing combat, before Nick being killed, before seeing these other Marines injured and killed. I mean, I was a completely different person. And everything in my life has been based around that deployment. It was by far the most impactful thing I've ever done and the most transformative thing I've ever done. And I don't think that anybody can go through something like that, whatever their version of it is, and not be a completely different person that's, you know, just there's really no going back after that.
I want you to put in your mind's eye, let's say right in front of you, you've got 30 young Marines, E2s and E3s out there. One of them, my son-in-law, actually he's a corporal now, so we'll throw in some E4s there too. So you've got so you've got about 30 junior enlisted Marines out there, and you've been given, 15, 20 minutes to talk to them. What's the core message you have for these guys?
It's a good question. Take care of each other and don't worry about what the bigger picture is. Just, you know, do it for yourselves, the Marine Corps, and take it seriously and live your life. Enjoy these moments because that period of your life is going to come to an end. I mean, yeah, you could stay in for 20 years, whatever, but that window of being a E2, E3, E4 in the Marine Corps and having that experience is a very small window. And you're so worked up and nervous and anxious and just busy with stuff all the time that you kind of lose sight of enjoying it. And you got to make sure that you do enjoy it and you understand how much of a privilege it is to wear that uniform and to get to serve this country.